On this day in history, January 1st, 1651, Charles II is crowned King of Scotland at Sconce Palace. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the king. Charles II, 1630 to 1685, King of Great Britain and Ireland, and the son of Charles I and Henrietta Maria, was born on May 29, 1630. About 1638, the Duke of Newcastle was appointed as his governor, but his education was interrupted by the Civil War. In 1645, Charles I sent him into the west of England, where his council included, among others, Sir Edward Hyde. In March 1646, the Royalist defeats drove him to the Scilly Isles and later to Jersey, and in July he joined his mother in Paris. He remained there under her control for 2 years, and continued his studies, Hobbes being his tutor for mathematics. In 1648, Charles cruised with some English ships off the mouth of the Thames, but effected nothing and retired to Holland. In January 1649, he sent a blank sheet of paper bearing his signature to Parliament, for the insertion of any terms that would save his father's life. After Charles I's execution on January 30th, 1649, he was proclaimed king in Scotland and parts of Ireland and in the Channel Islands. He went to Jersey in September, but was obliged to retire to Breda, February 1650, and from the place he came to terms with the Scots, accepting the Covenant and abandoning Montrose. He landed in Scotland on June 23, 1650, after pledging himself to Presbyterianism in both Scotland and England. An attempt to escape from the Covenanters, known as the Start, failed, and on January 1, 1651, Charles was crowned as King of the Scots at Sconce. Cromwell's advance forced him to march into England, and on September 3rd, Cromwell defeated him at Worcester. Charles showed great courage in the battle, and after an amazing series of adventures, including his concealment in the Royal Oak at Boscobel, sailed from Brighton to France on October 15th. His advisors were henceforth the Legitimists, Hyde, Ormond, and Nicholas. Plots for risings in England and Scotland and for Cromwell's assassination failed. In 1654, Cromwell's negotiations with France drove Charles to Germany, but after Cromwell's alliance with France, he made a treaty with Spain, April 1656, and resided at Bourges or Brussels. His chief source of income was a Spanish pension. Nevertheless, he was very poor. Cromwell's death did not immediately alter his position, and in 1659 he went to Fuenterrabia, where the Peace of the Pyrenees was being negotiated between France and Spain to ask for military aid. This journey and a royalist rising in England were alike fruitless. Events in England brought about the Restoration, which the Royalists alone could not have accomplished. By the end of 1659, a return to the old constitution was the only escape from the alternatives of military government or anarchy. Monk, Albemarle, advanced with an armed force from Scotland. By recalling the secluded members of the Long Parliament, power was transferred from the Independents to the Presbyterians. A free parliament was summoned to meet in April 1660, while Monk opened negotiations with Charles, who, following his advice, issued the Declaration of Breda, April 4th. Largely the work of Hyde, it promised a general amnesty and liberty of conscience, and guaranteed the transfers of land, leaving the final settlement in each case to Parliament. It also promised full arrears of pay to all ranks in the army. The Convention of Parliament, in which the secular peers again sat, accepted the declaration, and Charles was proclaimed king on May 8th. On May 26th, he landed at Dover, where he was met by Monk, and on May 29th, amid universal rejoicing, arrived at Whitehall. The agreement of Charles and Monk in leaving the settlement to Parliament meant that the restoration was a restoration of parliamentary government, not of personal monarchy. Charles was not a conqueror, and had no armed force of his own, while during the last 20 years almost all classes in England had acquired a permanent interest in politics. The administration could not be carried on without the help of men who had already been employed by the revolutionary governments, and the new council included faithful royalists and ex-rebels. The willing cooperation of the Convention and the unbounded loyalty of its successor in its earlier years encouraged Charles to entrust many matters to Parliament. The Restoration dissolved the legislative union with Scotland and Ireland, but led to the re-establishment of their separate parliaments. In Scotland, it was complete, and brought back episcopacy and repression. In Ireland, the Cromwellian settlement was firmly established and was upheld by English opinion. Hyde, created Earl of Clarendon, was still Charles's chief adviser, and directed the work of reconstruction in England. All the acts of the revolutionary government since 1642 were held to be invalid. Judicial proceedings since the date were confirmed by a special act. The Navigation Act of 1651 was reenacted. The abolition of feudal incidents, completed in 1656, was maintained by a new act. The Indemnity Bill led to disputes between Charles and Parliament, Charles desiring lenity. 13 regicides and young Sir Henry Vane were executed. 25 regicides, Lambert and Heselrigge, were imprisoned for life. Otherwise, the amnesty was complete. Crown and church lands, and other lands sequestered by the revolutionary governments, reverted to their former owners, but royalists who had sold part of their lands to meet the fines inflicted on them received no compensation. By means of special taxes, the army was paid off by February 1661. Charles, who had only a few life and foot guards, retained Monk's regiment of infantry, known henceforth as the Coldstream Guards, and a cavalry regiment, the Blues. By 1685, mainly by the return of regiments from Dunkirk and Tangier, this force was increased by 5 regiments of foot and 1 of dragoons. The government's income was fixed at £1,200,000, but the sources allocated did not produce that amount, and the government was involved from the start in pecuniary difficulties, for which it was not responsible. The restoration of the church was slower. Charles was pledged to toleration, and plans for comprehension were put forward. The convention was dissolved in December 1660 without settling anything, and the Savoy Conference between Anglicans and Presbyterians proved sterile. Charles was crowned on April 23, 1661, and a new parliament met on May 8th. As it sat until 1679, it is called the Long Parliament of the Restoration, and sometimes the Cavalier or the Pensionary Parliament. It was composed at the start almost entirely of Anglicans and thoroughgoing Royalists, and Charles and Clarendon could not restrain it on religious questions. The bishops returned to the upper house on November 20th, 1661. On May 19th, 1662, the Act of Uniformity was passed, enjoining the use of the Book of Common Prayer, which had been specially revised, and included new services on January 30th and May 29th, the dates of the execution of Charles I and the Restoration. As a result, about 1,200 of the clergy who refused to conform left their livings on St. Bartholomew's Day, August 12th. Another 800 had also been ejected. The Puritans, who had hitherto tried to gain control of the national church while remaining within it, took up a position definitely outside it. They came to be known as nonconformists or dissenters. Charles tried to relieve them and the Roman Catholics by a declaration issued on December 26, 1662, but it was opposed by Clarendon and by Parliament. And a series of acts was passed, including the Conventicle and 5 Mill Acts, forbidding the nonconformists their special forms of worship. It is unjustly called the Clarendon Code. The Corporation Act, 1661, drove the nonconformists from power in the boroughs. The Press Act, 1662, establishing a censorship, and the repeal of the Triennial Act, 1664, completed the reconstruction of the Constitution. Charles's foreign policy was largely a continuation of Cromwell's, although based on material rather than on religious considerations. Peace was made with Spain, but Jamaica and Dunkirk were retained, and Charles, when he married the Portuguese Catherine of Braganza in 1662, pledged himself to give Portugal military support in its struggle with Spain. The marriage, which brought Bombay and Tangier to England as parts of Catherine's dowry, drew England closer to France. The two countries were further connected by the marriage of Charles's sister, Henrietta Anne, to the Duke of Orleans, and by the sale of Dunkirk in France. Dunkirk was a costly possession and had lost most of its military or naval value, especially after the acquisition of Tangier. In 1664, English commercial expansion and minor political differences led to a war with the Dutch. The struggle was indecisive, but England was weakened by the Great Plague in 1665 and the Fire of London in 1666. Financial exhaustion led to negotiations, and in 1667 the Dutch, by burning the English ships in the Medway, enforced the conclusion of the Peace of Breda. Both sides kept their conquests, England obtaining New York and New Jersey. Parliament demanded a sacrifice and attacked Clarendon. Charles was annoyed by his opposition to toleration and tired of his lectures on his private misconduct. To the delight of the courtiers and the younger politicians, he allowed him to be exiled. Free from tutelage, Charles determined to follow his own policy. He disliked parliamentary control and believed that he could establish a strong monarchy upon the alliance of the Catholics and the dissenters. His desire for toleration and his personal inclination towards Catholicism, increased by his knowledge of the attitude of his younger brother James, Duke of York, alike recommended the policy. He also wanted to revenge himself on the Dutch for the humiliation at Chatham. Henceforward, he never gave complete confidence to any minister. He now employed Clifford and Arlington, both Catholics, but allowed Buckingham some show of power. These three were Ashley and Lauderdale, formed the notorious Cabal, so called because the first letters of their names formed the word. It was not a ministry in the modern sense, there being no common policy or joint responsibility. Charles hoped to attain his ends by the support of Louis XIV, who, engaged in promoting his queen's claims to the Spanish succession, was prepared to buy the alliance of the neutrality of England, or the neutrality of England. The Triple Alliance, formed in 1668 between England, Holland, and Sweden, appeared for a time to threaten Louis's projects. It was extremely popular in England, but Charles excused his share in it to Louis, whom it estranged from the Dutch. In 1669, Charles declared to the French ambassador his desire to be reconciled to Rome, and through the Duchess of Orleans negotiated with Louis the secret Treaty of Dover, signed on May 22, 1670. Charles was to declare himself a Catholic. In view of possible disturbances, Louis was to pay him £150,000 and to provide 6,000 men. Thereafter, France and England were to join in a war against the Dutch. Only Clifford and Arlington among the ministers signed this treaty. In December 1670, the whole cabal signed a feigned treaty, which omitted the conversion clauses. Charles was easily led to postpone them. What importance he attached to them cannot be determined. In 1671, Louis sent to England to become Charles's mistress, Louise de Keroualle, later Duchess of Portsmouth. The war against the Dutch began in 1672. At the same time, Charles issued the Declaration of Indulgence, suspending the penal laws and postponed all payments of assignations on the revenue. This was the stop of the exchequer, affecting the London bankers. The war, although it established British commercial and naval supremacy, was unpopular. In 1673, Parliament forced Charles to cancel the Declaration of Indulgence and to pass the Test Act, which drove Catholics, including Clifford and James, from office. In 1674, Charles was obliged to make peace with the Dutch. Danby, Sir Thomas Osborne, later Duke of Leeds, succeeded the cabal. His policy, based on the alliance of the Church and the Crown, was calculated to detach from the opposition the loyalists driven to it by hatred of the cabal. By patronage and corruption, he increased their number and formed a strong court party in Parliament. Ashley, now Earl of Shaftesbury, led the opposition country party, to which the by-elections furnished recruits. It was generally predominant, but French subsidies enabled Charles to resist it. Danby was obliged to concur in this, but tried to direct foreign policy along more popular lines, and in November 1677 brought about the marriage of James's daughter, Mary, with William of Orange, afterwards William III and Mary II. Charles turned against Louis, who, not without bribery, persuaded the country party to refuse supplies for the army. He then made the Peace of Nimwegen with the Dutch. Hatred of the cabal and distrust of Charles had prepared the way for Titus Oates, who, in August 1678, denounced an intended rising of the Catholics. The Popish plot, was almost entirely fictitious, as Charles readily discovered, but received apparent confirmation from Coleman's letters and Godfrey's death. Shaftesbury promoted the ensuing general panic. Charles let the agitation take its course, intervening only when Oates accused the Queen. Between 1678 and 1680, some 35 victims were executed, although Charles knew most of them to be innocent of the charges brought against them. He now realized the importance of the unhesitating support of the Church. He dissolved Parliament in January 1679 to save Danby from impeachment, for Louis XIV had revenged himself on Danby by divulging one of the letters written by Charles's order relating to the subsidy. The Press Act lapsed immediately, resulting in a flood of pamphlets and newspapers. James was sent abroad. An experimental reform of the council failed. The new parliament had to be dissolved within a few months. The exclusion of James from the succession in the throne was not proposed. His place was to be taken by Monmouth, Charles's eldest illegitimate son. A new parliament met in October 1680. The exclusion bill passed the Commons, but was defeated in the Lords by the genius of Halifax. The Commons refused to consider the alternative plan, which Charles was prepared to accept, of limiting the powers of a Catholic successor. In March 1681, a new parliament met at Oxford, where the London mob could not dominate it. But as the exclusion bill was introduced immediately, it was dissolved after sitting for 1 week only. Henceforth, Charles governed without parliaments. It was this time that the terms Whigs and Tory emerged as party names. Charles attacked the leading Whigs, but the London grand jury threw out the charge against Shaftesbury. A writ of quo warranto, brought against the City of London, compelled it to surrender its charter, whereupon a general attack was made on the municipal charters throughout the kingdom. The new charters gave the Tories control over the appointment of municipal officers and the return of the borough members. James returned from exile. Some of the defeated Whigs formed the Rye House plot in 1683. Its discovery led to the execution of Lord William Russell and Algernon Sidney. The Tory reaction had now reached its climax, but shortage of income compelled Charles, in spite of subsidies from Louis XIV, to abandon Tangier, 1683, and to allow the navy to decay. Meanwhile, he could only watch the increase of French power, including the seizure of Strasbourg. He may have been considering a change of policy when he was taken seriously ill on February 2, 1685. He made a profession of the Catholic faith, received the sacrament, and died on February 6th. In appearance, Charles was tall and dark. Besides numerous portraits, there is a wax effigy, taken from the corpse in Westminster Abbey. He was active, walked rapidly, and was an excellent horseman. He loved all outdoor sports, but was happiest at sea. He was a keen patron of the turf and rode himself. He had an excellent constitution, was careful about his diet, and rarely drank to excess. His manners were excellent, but he was affable and easy, but too good-natured to be able to refuse requests. His wit was more suitable for a private gentleman than for a king, but was free from malice. His fits of anger were rare and brief. His memory was excellent. His gaiety, good nature, and freedom from pretense made him generally popular. His notorious lasciviousness contained no seraphic element. He accepted the mistresses chosen for him. The sums he spent on them did not embarrass his finances, but made it difficult for him to ask Parliament for money for other purposes. He had no legitimate children. The most important of his many illegitimate children were, by Lucy Walter, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth and Buccleuch, 1649 to 1685, by Lady Castlemaine, later Duchess of Cleveland, Charles, Henry, and George Fitzroy, Dukes of Southampton, Grafton, and Northumberland, and the Countesses of Sussex and Lichfield, by the Duchess of Portsmouth, Charles Lennox, Duke of Richmond, by Nell Gwynn, Charles Beauclerk, Duke of St. Albans, by Catherine Pegg, Charles Fitzcharles, Earl of Plymouth, by Lady Shannon, the Countess of Yarmouth, by Mary Davis, the Countess of Derwentwater. Nell Gwyn, an actress, was the most popular of the mistresses, and Charles appreciated her wit. Charles once said that he was no atheist, but he could not think God would make a man miserable only for him taking a little pleasure out of the way. He inclined towards Roman Catholicism, partly on political grounds, but Halifax, perhaps reflecting Charles's own view, thought the creed most compatible with his lax morality. The date of his change of belief is uncertain, but in 1660 he was apparently determined to marry a Catholic. He was not reconciled to Rome until his deathbed, and attended Anglican services regularly during his life. He was a good judge of sermons, and did not object to remonstrances, so long as he was not expected to reform, and they were in good taste. His desire for toleration was based on indifference and good nature, and the memory of his promises, not on principle. Charles was interested in science, had his own laboratory, and gave the Royal Society its charter. He encouraged applied science, especially when it concerned navigation. His knowledge of naval architecture was praised by Pious, but was considered by most contemporaries to be greater than his rank permitted. He patronized the theater and enjoyed the lighter forms of literature. The reign was politically sterile because Charles's achievements were undone and his foreign policy reversed by the Revolution of 1688. But the transfer of power from the Crown to the House of Commons went on steadily during the existence of the Long Parliament of the Restoration. It was a time of administrative progress, notably in the navy and in the treasury systems, and between 1660 and 1688 the administration of the old colonial empire reached its highest point of efficiency. Charles himself contributed by his interest in naval, commercial, and colonial expansion, but sacrificed these objects too easily to his personal and dynastic policy. Attempts to vindicate the latter have failed. Much of his conduct admits no justification. He was too lazy and fond of pleasure to apply himself steadily to business, but energetic on occasion and always intelligent. Halifax notes his powers of dissimulation. He was unwilling to face prolonged opposition, being determined not to go on his travels again. He was selfish and callous, but not vindictive. During his reign there was great material and intellectual progress and some improvement in manners. Writers who denounce the morals of the age rely too much on Pious and Grammont. The tendency has been to judge the country at large by Charles's characteristics and to dwell on his vices without considering his gifts. Closer study is modifying many of the older verdicts. On this day in history, January 2nd, 1647, Nathaniel Bacon, English-American rebel leader, is born. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the man. Nathaniel Bacon, born circa 1647, died 1676. A Virginian colonial politician and soldier, was born at Friston Hall in Suffolk, England. He graduated at Cambridge when about 21 years of age, but had interrupted his studies in 1663 to join a party which made an extended trip through the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and France. He later studied at the Inns of Court in London. In 1674 he married Elizabeth, the daughter of Sir Edward Duke, and sailed for Virginia late in the same year. There Bacon acquired several estates, one where Richmond now stands, and another where he made his home, on the James River, about 40 miles above Jamestown. Having high social standing, ample financial means, and a keen intelligence, he was soon appointed a member of the Governor's Council, in which he acquired the first-hand knowledge of Governor Berkeley's policy and character which induced him to undertake Bacon's rebellion. The report of the Royal Commission sent to Virginia after the rebellion describes him as indifferent, tall, but slender, black-haired, and of an ominous, pensive, melancholy aspect, of a pestilent and prevalent logical discourse tending to atheism in most companies, not giving to much talk, or to make sudden replies, of a most imperious and dangerous hidden pride of heart, despising the wisest of his neighbors for their ignorance, and very ambitious and arrogant. This is manifestly the official portrait of an outlaw, and is widely at variance with the report of his admirers, who represented him as of genial manners, and, although himself an aristocrat, of democratic political convictions, which made him popular with all who disapproved of the absolutism of Governor Berkeley. It is increasingly apparent that the part played by Bacon in the formation of an American national consciousness was a great one, and the circumstances attending the rebellion make it evident that this part could be played only by a man of very distinctive personality. Bacon died during a campaign, probably of malaria, on October 1st, 1676. On this day in history, January 3rd, 1521, Pope Leo X excommunicates Martin Luther in the papal bull De Sed Romanum Pontificem. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of Martin Luther and the Diet of Worms. In January 1521, the Pope, in consequence of Luther's refusal to retract and submit to the authority of the Church, launched a bull of excommunications against him, De Sed Romanum, and called on Emperor Charles V, the successor of Maximilian, to execute it forthwith. Instead of complying, the emperor, in deference to the intervention of the Saxon election and will of the majority of the Diet, which met at Worms at the end of January and continued its sittings till May, decided to summon him to appear for examination before the Diet under the imperial safe-conduct, whilst promulgating an edict against his writings at the instigation of the papal nuncio Aleander. On April 16th, Luther entered Worms. On his appearance before the assembly on the following day, he acknowledged the authority of the books on the table, the titles of which were recited by the secretary. But, in answer to the question whether he was prepared to recant any part of them, he asked for time for consideration on the ground of the importance of the issue involved. He was granted an interval of 24 hours. Late on the morrow, the 18th, he was asked by the official of the Archbishop of Treves, Dr. John von der Echen, who acted as interrogator, whether he was prepared to defend all the books which he had recognized as his. In reply, he proceeded to show why he should not be asked straight away to recant, and recognized to be convinced on his errors from Scripture. If thus convinced, he would forthwith revoke and be the first to throw his books into the fire. In a long harangue, the official rebuked his audacity in arrogating a knowledge of the Scriptures against all the doctors of the Church, and concluded by demanding a definite and straightforward answer to the question whether he would retract his errors or not. Then came the fateful words, uttered in firm and clear tones. Unless I am convinced by the testimony of Scripture or by an evident reason, ratione evidente, for I confide neither in the Pope nor in a council alone, since it is certain that they have often erred and contradicted themselves. I am held fast by the Scriptures adduced by me, and my conscience is taken captive by God's word, and I neither can nor will revoke anything, seeing that it is not safe or right to act against conscience. God help me. Amen. On retiring from the excited assembly, he was greeted by the emperor's Spanish guards with the cry, "To the fire with him!" whilst he and his adherents passed on with uplifted hands after the old German fashion of celebrating a victory. "I am through," he cried joyfully on reaching his lodgings and receiving the congratulation of his friends. He persisted in his refusal before a committee appointed by the Diet to bring about a feasible accommodation, and was commanded by the emperor to leave Worms on April 26th. On May 4th he was intercepted by a party of horsemen in the Thuringian forest, in accordance with a previous arrangement of the Elector of Saxony and two of his trusty councillors, and was furtively lodged in the electoral castle on the Wartburg, overlooking Eisenach. On May 26th, after the close of the Diet on the previous day, the emperor, having received the assurance of the papal support in his war against Francis I of France, formally signed the Edict of Worms, placing him and his adherents under the ban of the empire and instituting a rigorous censorship of the press. It professed to be issued with the unanimous consent and will of the estates of the empire. In reality, it had been submitted on the previous evening to only a fraction of the members after the formal closing of the Diet, and did not represent the mind of the German people. As the result of these 4 years of strenuous conflict, the breach between Rome and Luther was complete and irretrievable, and the indomitable heroic monk had won the sympathy and support of a large proportion of his countrymen on material and economic as well as religious grounds. On this day in history, January 4th, 1878, as part of the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, Sofia is liberated from Ottoman rule. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. The colony of Serdica, Founded here by the Emperor Trajan, became a Roman provincial town of considerable importance in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD and was favorite residence of Constantine the Great. Serdica was burnt by the Huns in 447 AD. Few traces remain of the Roman city, but more than 100 types of its coins attest its importance. The town was taken by the Bulgarians under Krum in 809 AD. The name Serdica was converted into Sredets by the Slavs, who associated it with Sreda, middle, and the Slavonic form subsequently became the Byzantine Triaditsa. The name Sofia, which came into use towards the end of the 14th century, is derived from the early medieval church of St. Sophia. The town successfully resisted the attacks of the Emperor Basil II in 987 between 1018 and 1186. Under Byzantine rule, it served as a frontier fortress. During this period, Pechenegs were settled around Sofia. These are probably the ancestors of the modern Salps. In 1382, Sofia was captured by the Turks. In 1443, it was for a brief time occupied by the Hungarians under John Hunyadi. Under the Turkish rule, the city was for nearly 4 centuries the residence of the Beylerbey, or Governor-General, of the whole Balkan Peninsula except Bosnia and the Morea. During the period, the population was mainly Turkish. In 1553, the town possessed 11 large and 100 small mosques. It was occupied by Russian troops in 1829 and 1878. Though less central than Philippopolis and less renowned in Bulgarian history than Tarnovo, Sofia was selected as the capital of the newly created Bulgarian state in view of its strategical importance, which commands the routes to Constantinople, Belgrade, Macedonia, and the Danube. On this day in history, January 5th, 1477, the Battle of Nancy is fought, in which Charles the Bold is defeated and killed in a conflict with René II, Duke of Lorraine, and Burgundy subsequently becomes part of France. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Nancy, a town of northeastern France, the capital formerly of the province of Lorraine, and now of the department of Meurthe-et-Moselle, 219 miles east of Paris on the railway to Strasbourg. Population, from 1936, 121,301. At the close of the 11th century, Alderic of Nancy, brother of Gerard of Alsace, possessed at Nancy a castle which enabled him to defy the united assaults of the bishops of Metz and Treves, and the Count of Bar. In the 12th century, the town was surrounded with walls and became the capital of the Dukes of Lorraine, and in 1477, Charles the Bold was defeated here by René II. Refortified by Charles III, it was taken by the French in 1633. After the Peace of Ryswick in 1679, it was restored to Duke Leopold. He found academies, established manufactures, and set about the construction of the new town. But it was reserved for Stanislaus Leszczynski, a former king of Poland and the last of the Dukes of Lorraine, to make Nancy one of the palatial cities of Europe. The city, which became French in 1766, was occupied by the Allies in 1814 and 1815, and put to ransom by the Prussians in 1870. After the Franco-German War, the population was greatly increased by immigrants, although Nancy remained outside the area of actual fighting during World War I. It was bombed and shelled, but the damage was not very serious. In World War II, it was occupied by the Germans in June 1940 and suffered heavy bombing raids. Nancy stands on the left bank of the Meurthe, 6 miles above its junction with the Moselle and on the Marne-Rhine Canal, called the East Canal. The railway from Paris to Strasbourg skirts the city on the southwest side. Other railways, to Metz, to Epinal by Méricourt, to Château Salins, join the main line near Nancy and make it an important junction. The town consists of 2 portions, de Villeville, with narrow and winding streets, and de Villeneuve, 16th to 18th centuries, with wide straight streets. Between the two lies the Place Stanislas, and on all sides rise imposing buildings of the 18th century, the town hall, episcopal palace, etc. A fine triumphal arch erected by Stanislas in honor of Louis XV leads from the Place Stanislas to the Place Carrière, which forms a beautiful tree-planted promenade, containing, at its further end, the governmental palace, 1760, now the residence of the general commanding the 10th Army Corps, and adjoins the so-called pépinière nursery established by Stanislaus. The cathedral in the Villa Neuve, built in the 18th century, has a wide facade flanked by 2 dome-surmounted towers. Of particular interest is the Church of the Cordeliers, in the Old Town, built by René II about 1482 to commemorate his victory over Charles the Bold. Pillaged during the Revolution period, but restored to religious uses in 1825, it contains the tombs of the Counts of Vaudemont. Here also is a chapel built at the beginning of the 17th century to receive the tombs of the princes of the House of Lorraine. The Church of St. Epvre, rebuilt between 1864 and 1874, on the site of an old church of the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, has a fine spire and belfry and good stained glass windows. Of the old ducal palace, begun in the 15th century by Duke Raoul and completed by René II, there remains but a single wing, partly rebuilt after a fire in 1871. The entrance to this wing, which contains the Archaeological Museum of Lorraine, is Gothic of the early 16th century. One of the greatest treasures of the collection is the tapestry found in the tent of Charles the Bold after the Battle of Nancy. Of the old gates of Nancy, the most ancient and remarkable is the Porte de la Croix, 1463. The town hall contains a museum of painting and sculpture. Nancy is the seat of a bishop, a prefect, a court of appeal, and a court of assizes, headquarters of the 10th Army Corps, and center of an académie, educational division, with a university comprising faculties of law, medicine, science, and letters, and a higher school of pharmacy. There are also tribunals of first instance and of commerce, a board of trade arbitrators, and a national school of forestry. The industries of Nancy include printing, brewing, cloth and wool spinning, and weaving of cotton and woolen goods, and the manufacture of tobacco, by the state, of boots and shoes, straw hats, pottery, casks, embroidery, machinery, motor cars, and spare parts, engineering material, farm implements, and iron goods. On this day in history, January 6th, 1066, following the death of Edward the Confessor on the previous day, the Witan meets to confirm Harold Godwinson as the new King of England. Harold is crowned the same day, sparking a succession crisis that will eventually lead to the Norman conquest of England. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of King Harold. Harold II, born circa 1022, died 1066. King of the English, the second son of Earl Godwine, was born about 1022. While still very young, before 1045, he was appointed through his father's influence with Edward the Confessor to the earldom of the East Angles. He shared his father's outlawry and banishment in 1051, but while Godwine went to Flanders, Harold, with his brother Leofwine, took refuge in Ireland. In 1052, the uneasiness felt at the visit to England of William, Duke of Normandy, who was known to covet the English throne, caused a reaction in favor of Godwine, who returned to England with his sons under arms. The Witan finally decreed that their land should be restored. Harold therefore received his earldom of the East Angles, and on his father's death in 1053 succeeded him in the greater earldom of the West Saxons, Sweyn having died while on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Harold was now the chief man in the kingdom, and the latter part of Edward's reign was virtually the reign of Harold. On the death, 1055, of Siward, Earl of Northumbria, Edward, at the instigation of Harold, appointed his brother Tostig, Earl of Northumbria. Earl Elfgar looked upon this appointment as a menace to the Mercian house, and his opposition led Harold to procure his outlawry by the Witan. Elfgar then joined Gruffudd, Prince of North Wales, in an attack on Hereford, as a result of which Elfgar regained his position as Earl of East Anglia. In 1057, with the exception of Mercia, Harold and his brothers held all the earldoms throughout England. Elfgar, in order to secure a useful ally, married his daughter Ealdgif to Gruffudd. Elfgar died in 1062 and was succeeded by his son Edwin. In spite of the alliance between the Mercians and the Welsh, Harold and Tostig raided Wales in 1063 and forced Gruffudd, who was eventually killed by his own men, to flee. In 1063, Harold was shipwrecked on the French coast and captured by the Normans, who only released him on his oath on sacred relics, though at the time he was unaware of their nature, to support William in any claim for the English throne. Probably on his return to England, though the date is uncertain, Harold married Ealdgyth, Edith, sister of Edwin, the widow of Gruffydd, thus conciliating the powerful Earl of Mercia. His mistress, Eadgyth of the Swan Neck, the mother of his children, was still living. In 1065, the Northumbrians revolted against Tostig's rule, choosing Morkere, brother of Edwin of Mercia, in his place. Harold acted as mediator, but was compelled to agree to the banishment of Tostig, who was thenceforth his bitterest enemy. On January 6, 1066, Edward died, recommending Harold as his successor. He was accordingly elected at once and crowned. He won over the men of Northumbria and prepared against the attacks which threatened on both sides. William challenged the crown, alleging both a bequest of Edward in his favor and Harold's oath, and prepared to invade England. From May to September, Harold kept men and ships in readiness on the south coast, but at last provisions failed, and he returned to London. At this time, Harald Hardrada of Norway, supported by Tostig in the north, invaded England. Together they sailed up the Humber, defeated Edwin and Morkere, and received the submission of York. Harold hurried northwards, and on September 25th won a complete victory over the Northmen at Stamford Bridge, in which Tostig and Harald Hardrada were slain. 2 days later, Harold received news that William had landed at Pevensey, and he marched southward as fast as possible. He gathered his army in London from all southern and eastern England, while Edwin and Morkere held the north. The king then marched into Sussex and engaged the Normans. October 14, 1066. On the hill of Senlac near Battle, after a fight lasting all day, the Normans had the victory. Harold, wounded by an arrow in the eye, and his two brothers Gareth and Leofwine lay dead on the field. Harold had 3 sons, Godwine, Edmund, and Magnus, and 2 daughters, probably the children of Edith of the Swan Neck. Another son was named Ulf, by his wife Ealdgyth, who was sent for safety to Chester in 1066. He had a posthumous son, Harold, who took part in the expedition of Magnus Barefoot to the Scottish Isles in 1098. Harold's body is said to have been taken from the cairn of stones on the seashore where it was originally buried to Waltham. On this day in history, January 7th, 1558, French troops led by Francis, Duke of Guise, take Calais, the last continental possession of England. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Calais, a seaport and manufacturing town of northern France, in the department of Pas-de-Calais, 22 miles east by southeast of Dover, and 185 miles north of Paris by the Northern Railway. Population, 1936, 57,349. The old town stands on an island hemmed in by the canal and the harbor basins which divide it from the much more extensive manufacturing quarter of St. Pierre, enveloping it on the east and south. The demolition of the ramparts of Old Calais was followed by the construction of a new circle of defenses now obsolete. Calais was a fishing village with natural harbor until the end of the 10th century. It was first improved by Baldwin IV, Count of Flanders, in 997, and in 1224 was regularly fortified by Philip Orpel, Count of Boulogne. It was besieged in 1346 after the Battle of Crécy by Edward III, and taken after resisting for nearly a year. This city remained in the hands of the English till 1558, when it was taken by Francis, Duke of Guise, from the ill-provided English garrison. From this time, the Calais, or territory of Calais, was known as the Pays Reconquis. It was held by the Spaniards from 1595 to 1598, but was restored to France by the Treaty of Vervins. In the center of the old town is the Place d'Armes, in which stands the former Hôtel de Ville, rebuilt in 1740, restored 1867. It was much damaged during World War I by bombardment, 1914-16. The belfry belongs to the 16th and early 17th centuries. Close by is the Tour de Guet, or watchtower, used as a lighthouse until 1848. The Church of Notre Dame, built during the English occupancy, shows the influence of English Gothic. A gateway flanked by turrets, 14th century, is a relic of the Hôtel de Guise, built as a guild hall for the English wool staplers, and given to the Duke of Guise as a reward for the recapture of Calais. In both World Wars I and II, Calais was one of the main debarkation ports of the English expeditionary forces. Calais is the principal port for the continental passenger and mail traffic with England carried by the SR and the French railways. The principal exports are woven goods, glassware, lace, and metalware. Imports include petroleum, timber, raw wool, cotton yarn. The main industry is the manufacture of lace, for which it is the chief center in France. Sawmilling, boat building, and the manufacture of artificial ice, biscuits, soap, submarine, and telephone cables is also carried on. Deep sea and coastal fishing for cod, herring, and mackerel are also important. The tonnage of the port almost doubled between 1913 and 1918, in spite of the stoppage of civilian traffic, owing to the enormous quantity of war material that was dealt with. The port equipment was much improved to cope with military needs. A quay, 360 yards long, was finished in 1918, and the new west dock has a depth of from 26 feet to 30 feet on the sill. Work on the entrance to the port was resumed in 1921 and the west jetty completed. By the construction of an elevator, canal boats of 300 tons can reach the large canal dock. The harbor is connected with the River Aya and the navigable waterways of the department. On this day in history, January 8, 1746, as part of the Second Jacobite Rising, Bonnie Prince Charles occupies Stirling. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Stirling, Royal, Municipal, and Police Borough, Parish, River, Port, and County Town of Stirlingshire, Scotland. Population, from 1931, 22,593. It is finally situated on the right bank of the Forth, 39 3/4 miles northwest of Edinburgh, and 29.5 miles northeast of Glasgow, being served by the LNE and LMS railways. The old town occupies the slopes of a basaltic hill, 420 feet above the sea, terminating on the north and west in a precipice. The modern quarters have been laid out on the level ground at the base, especially towards the south. Remains of a town wall exist at the south end of the Black Walk. Formerly, there were two main entrances, the South Port and the Old Brig, over the Forth to the north, a high-pitched structure of 4 arches now used only by foot passengers. It dates back from the end of the 14th century and was once literally the key to the Highlands. Just below it is the bridge erected in 1829 from designs by Robert Stephenson, and below this again the railway viaduct. The castle crowning the hill is of unknown age, but from the time that Alexander I died within its walls in 1124 till the union of the crowns in 1603, it was intimately associated with the fortunes of the Scottish monarchs. It is approached from the esplanade on which stands a colossal statue of Robert Bruce. The main gateway, built by James III, gives access to the lower and then to the upper square on the south side, of which stands the palace, begun by James V, 1540, and completed by Mary of Guise. The east side of the quadrangle is occupied by the Parliament House, a Gothic building of the time of James III, now used as a barracks room and stores. On the north side of the square is the Chapel Royal, founded by Alexander I, rebuilt in the 15th century and again in 1594 by James VI, who was christened in it, and afterwards converted into an armory and finally a storeroom. Below it is Gowan Hill, and beyond this the Moat or Heading Hill, on which Murdoch Stuart, 2nd Duke of Albany, his 2 sons, and his father-in-law, the Earl of Lennox, were beheaded in 1425. In the plain on the southwest were the King's Gardens, now under grass, and with an octagonal turf-covered mound called the King's Knot in the center. Farther south lies the King's Park, on a hill of lower elevation than the castle, and separated from the esplanade by a depression styled the Valley, the tilting ground of former times. A cemetery has been laid out. Here is the Virgin Martyrs Memorial, in memory of Margaret McLaughlin and Margaret Wilson, who were drowned by the rising tide in Wigtown Bay for their fidelity to the Covenant, 1685. The large pyramid to the memory of the Covenanters, and the Ladies' Rock, from which ladies viewed the jousts in the valley. Adjoining the cemetery on the south is the parish church, portions of which may have formed part of the first church, founded by David I. Since the Reformation, It has been divided into two churches. The choir, each church, was added in 1494 by James IV, and the apse a few years later. At the west stands the stately battlemented square tower. The nave, the West Church, is a transition between Romanesque and Gothic, with pointed windows. The crow-steeped Gothic gable of the south transept affords the main entrance to both churches. The choir is in the decorated and perpendicular styles. Within its walls, Mary Queen of Scots was crowned in 1543, when 9 months old, and in the same year, the Earl of Arran, Regent of Scotland, abjured Protestantism. In 1544, an assembly of nobles appointed Mary of Guise Queen Regent. On July 29, 1567, James VI was crowned, John Knox preaching the sermon, and in August 1571 and June 1578, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland met. James Guthrie, 1612 to 1661, the martyr, and Ebenezer Erskine, 1680 to 1794, founder of the Scottish Secession Church, were two of the most distinguished ministers. To the southwest of the church is Cowan's Hospital, founded in 1639 by John Cowan, Dean of Guild, and now used as a guild hall. Adjoining it is the military prison. Near the principal entrance to the esplanade stands Argyll's Lodging, erected about 1630 by the first Earl of Stirling. On his death in 1640, it passed to the first Marquess of Argyll, and is now a military hospital. Broad Street contains Mar's work. The palace, built by John Erskine, 1st or 6th Earl of Mar, about 1570, according to tradition, out of the stones of Cambuskenneth Abbey, the old townhouse, erected in 1701 to replace that in which John Hamilton, the last Roman Catholic Archbishop of St. Andrews, was hanged for alleged complicity in the murders of Darnley and the Regent Moray. The town cross, restored in 1891, and the house, which was, as a mural tablet says, the nursery of James VI and his son Prince Henry. The Smith Institute, founded in 1873 by Thomas Stuart Smith, an artist, contains a picture gallery, museum, and reading room. Woolen spinning and manufactures are the staple industry, and iron founding, carriage building, and agricultural implement making are also carried on. In addition to furniture factories, cooperage, and rubber works, there is some shipping from the small harbor, which is accessible only at high water. Stirling is under the jurisdiction of a council with provost and bailies, and, with Falkirk and Granagmouth, returns a member to Parliament. The Abbey Craig, an outlying spur of the Ochils, 1.5 miles northeast of Stirling, is a thickly wooded hill on the top of which stands the Wallace Monument, 1869, a baronial tower with a Valhalla containing busts of eminent Scotsmen. Cambuskenneth Abbey, on the left bank of the Forth, about 1 mile east by northeast of Stirling, was founded by David I in 1147 for monks of the Order of St. Augustine. Several Scots parliaments met within its walls. At the Reformation, Mary Queen of Scots bestowed it on the first Earl of Mar, 1562, who is said to have used these stones for his palace in Stirling. All that remains of the abbey is the massive 4-storied tower, the west doorway, and the foundations of some of the walls. The bones of James III and his queen, Margaret of Denmark, who were buried within the precincts, were discovered in 1864 and reinterred next year under a tomb at the High Altar. Stirling was known also as Snowdon, which became the official title of the Scots Heralds. The Romans probably had a station here. In 1119 it was a royal burgh, and under Alexander I was one of the Court of 4 burghs, superseded under James III by the Convention of Royal Burghs. In 1174, it was handed over to the English in security for the Treaty of Falaise, being restored to the Scots by Richard I. The earliest known charter was that granted in 1226 by Alexander II, who made the castle a royal residence. The fortress was repeatedly besieged during the Wars of the Scottish Independence. In 1304, it fell with the town to Edward I. The English held it for 10 years, and it was in order to raise the Scottish siege in 1314 that Edward II risked the Battle of Bannockburn. Edward Balliol surrendered it in 1334 in terms of his compact with Edward III, but the Scots regained it in 1339. From this time till the collapse of Queen Mary's fortunes in 1568, Stirling almost shared with Edinburgh the rank and privileges of a capital of the kingdom. It was the birthplace of James II in 1430, and probably of James III and James IV. In 1571, an attempt was made to surprise the castle by Mary's adherents, the regent Lennox being slain in the fray, and 7 years later it was captured by James Douglas, 4th Earl of Morton, after which a reconciliation took place between the Protestants and Roman Catholics. It was occupied in 1584 by the Earls of Angus and Mar, the Protestant leaders, who, however, fled to England on the approach of the king. Next year they returned with a strong force and compelled James VI to open the gates, his personal safety having been guaranteed. In 1594, Prince Henry was baptized in the Chapel Royal, which had been rebuilt on a larger scale. After the Union of the Crowns, 1603, Stirling ceased to play a prominent part on the national stage. The Privy Council and Court of Session met in the town in 1637, on account of the disturbed state of Edinburgh. In 1641, Charles I gave it its last governing charter, and 4 years afterwards Parliament was held in Stirling on account of the plague in the capital, but the outbreak of the pest in Stirling caused the legislators to remove to Perth. During the Civil War, the Covenanters held the town, to which the committees of Church and State adjourned after Cromwell's victory at Dunbar, 1650. But in August next year, the castle was taken by General Monk. In 1715, the 3rd Duke of Argyll held it to prevent the passage of the 4th by the Jacobites, and in 1746 it was ineffectually besieged by Prince Charles Edward. On this day in history, January 9th, 1792, the Treaty of Jessay between Russian and Ottoman Empire is signed, ending the Russo-Turkish War of 1787-92. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Jessay, the capital of the department of Jessay, Romania, situated on the left bank of the river Buli, an affluent of the Gigea, about 10 miles west of Pruth. Population from 1939, 104,471, including a great number of Jews. Jessay communicates by rail with Galatz, Kishinev, and Chernovitz. The surrounding country is one of uplands and woods, among which rise the monasteries of Cetatea, Formosa, and Galata, with its mineral springs, the water cure establishment of Rapide, and the great seminary of Sokola. Jessay is the seat of the Metropolitan of Moldavia and Sofia, and of a Roman Catholic archbishop. The two oldest churches date from the reign of Stephen the Great, 1458 to 1504. Perhaps the finest, however, are the 17th century Metropolitan St. Spiridion and Tre Ararchi, the last a curious example of Byzantine art, erected in 1640 by Vasily Lupo, the wolf, and adorned with countless gilded carvings on its outer walls and twin towers. The St. Spiridion Foundation, due to the liberality of Prince Gregory Gica in 1727 and available for the sick of all countries and creeds, maintains hospitals and churches in several towns of Moldavia, besides the baths at Slanik in Wallachia. There are 6 hospitals, the chief Romanian university, a military academy, and schools of art, music, and commerce. 3 museums, a fine hall and a theater, the state library, where the chief records of Romanian history are preserved, an appeal court, a chamber of commerce, and several banks. The city is the headquarters of the 4th Army Corps. It has an active trade in petroleum, salt, metals, timber, cereals, fruit, wine, spirits, preserved meat, textiles, clothing, leather, cardboard, and cigarette paper, and a considerable industry. Jessay is mentioned as early as the 14th century and probably derives its name from the Cuman jaziks, or bowmen. It was often visited by the Moldavian court. In 1565, Prince Alexander Lupasnenu moved the capital of Moldavia from Suceava to Jessay. It was already famous as a center of culture. Between 1561 and 1563, an excellent school and a Lutheran church were founded by the Greek adventurer Jacob Basilicus. In 1645, the first printed book published in Moldavia was issued from a press established by Vasily Lupo. He also founded a school, the first in which the mother tongue took the place of Greek. Jessay was burned by the Tartars in 1513, by the Turks in 1538, and by the Russians in 1686. By the Peace of Jessay, the Second Russo-Turkish War was brought to a close in 1792. A Greek insurrection under Ypsilanti in 1821 led to the storming of the city by the Turks in 1822. In 1844, there was a severe conflagration. In 1861, the government of Romania was removed to Bucharest, but during World War I was again temporarily transferred to Gizeh. On this day in history, January 10th, 1776, as part of the American Revolution, Thomas Paine publishes his pamphlet Common Sense. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the author. Thomas Paine, born 1737, died 1809, English author, was born at Thetford, Norfolk, the son of a Quaker stye-maker. After several years at sea and after trying various occupations on land, Paine took up his father's trade in London, where he supplemented his meager grammar school education for attending science lectures. He was given in 1762 an appointment in the excise, was discharged for neglect of duty in 1765, but on offering explanations and apologies, was restored, taking an appointment in 1768 at Lewes. His married life was unhappy, his finances became embarrassed, and in 1774 he left Lewes, losing his post, leaving his goods to his creditors, and separating from his wife. Encouraged by Benjamin Franklin, he sailed to America, where he arrived in November 1774 and was set to edit the Pennsylvania Magazine. On January 10, 1776, he published Common Sense, a remarkable and powerful Republican pamphlet which had an immediate success. Written in simple, convincing language, it was read everywhere, and the open movement to independence dates from its publication. Washington said that it worked a powerful change in the minds of many men. When war was declared, and fortune at first went against the colonists, Paine, who was then serving with General Greene as volunteer aide-de-camp, wrote the first of a series of influential tracts called The Crisis, of which the opening words, "These are the times that try men's souls," became a battle cry. Paine's services were recognized by an appointment to the Secretary of the Commission, sent by Congress to treat with the Indians, and a few months later to be Secretary of the Congressional Committee of Foreign Affairs. In 1775, however, he indiscreetly published information gained from his official position, and was compelled to resign. He was afterwards clerk of the Pennsylvania legislature, and accompanied John Laurens during his mission to France. His services were eventually recognized by the state of New York by a grant of an estate at New Rochelle. From Congress he received considerable gifts of money. In 1787 he sailed for Europe with the model of an iron bridge he had designed, but his chief object was to repeat his American success. His first editors, in the Prospects of the Rubicon, 1787, were directed against Pitt's war policy. When Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France appeared in 1790, Paine at once wrote his answer, The Rights of Man. The first part appeared on March 13, 1791, and had an enormous circulation before the government took alarm and endeavored to suppress it. Pitt used to say, according to Lady Hester Stanhope, that Tom Paine was quite in the right, but then he would add, "What am I to do? As things are, if I were to encourage Tom Paine's opinions, we should have a bloody revolution." Paine was indicted for treason in May 1792, but before the trial came off he was elected by the Department of Calais to the French Convention. William Blake, the poet, hustled him prudently out of England, and he took his seat in the French Convention. Paine, who understood neither the French language nor the dreadful difficulties of the Revolution, rapidly made himself unpopular with the Jacobins. He incurred the suspicion of Robespierre, was thrown into prison, and escaped the guillotine by an accident. Before his arrest, he had completed the first part of the Age of Reason, the publication of which made an instant change in his position on both sides of the Atlantic, the indignation in the United States being as strong as in England. The Age of Reason was written from the point of view of a Quaker who did not believe in revealed religion, but who held that all religions are in their nature mild and benign, when not associated with political systems. Mixed with the unceremonious ridicule of what he considered superstition are many passages of earnest and even lofty eloquence in favor of a pure morality found on natural religion. The work, in short, a second part, written during his 10 months' imprisonment, was published after his release, represents the deism of the 18th century in the hands of a rough, ready, passionate controversialist. At the downfall of Robespierre, Paine was restored to his seat in the convention and served until it adjourned in October 1795, his last speech being an effort to save universal suffrage. In 1796, he published a long letter to Washington, attacking his military reputation and his presidential policy with a bitterness due to his belief that Washington and the Americans had deserted him when in danger of death in France. In 1802, Paine sailed for America, but found his popularity extinguished. He died in New York on June 8, 1809, and his body was in 1819 removed to England by William Cobbett. On this day in history, January 11th, 1786, Joseph Jackson Lister, English physicist, is born. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the physicist. Joseph Jackson Lister, born 1786, died 1869. English scientist and father of Joseph Lister, was born in London, January 11th, 1786. He had only a few years of formal schooling, but even after he no longer attended classes, he was diligent in educating himself. He became a wine merchant by trade, taking over his father's shop, but his interest lay in lenses even as a child, and in 1824 he began his work on the compound microscope, which was to be his chief contribution to science. In 1830, in a paper on the improvement of compound microscopes, which he read before the Royal Society, he made public the results of 6 years' work on the microscope. During that time, he had discovered the principle of aplanotic foci, which enabled him to outline to W. Tully, a noted optician, the methods for constructing a powerful achromatic microscope, which would transmit images with almost no distortion. It was excessive distortion of the image which had previously prevented the microscope from taking its proper place in scientific research. In addition to his work with the microscope, Lister made important studies on mammalian blood and invented the photographer's tripod. He died in Upton, Essex, October 24th, 1869. On this day in history, January 12th, 1792, Federalist Thomas Pinckney appointed first U.S. Minister to Britain. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the statesman. Thomas Pinckney, born 1750, died 1828. American statesman and diplomat, was born in Charleston, South Carolina on October 23, 1750, a younger brother of Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Educated in England, he returned to Charleston in 1773 and was admitted to the bar in 1774. During the American Revolution, his early training at the French Military College at Caen enabled him to render effective service to General Benjamin Lincoln, Count d'Estaing, and General Horatio Gates. In the Battle of Camden, he was badly wounded and captured, remaining a prisoner for more than a year. Subsequently, he was governor of South Carolina in 1787 to 89. Presided over the state convention which ratified the federal constitution in 1788 and was United States minister to Great Britain in 1792 to 96. During part of this time, 1794 to 95, he was also envoy extraordinary to Spain, and in this capacity negotiated, 1795, the important Treaty of San Lorenzo el Real. By that treaty, the boundary between the United States and East and West Florida, and between the United States and Louisiana, was settled. Spain relinquishing all claims east of the Mississippi above the 31st degree north latitude, and the United States secured the freedom of navigation of the Mississippi to its mouth. In 1796, Pinckney was the Federalist candidate for vice president, and in 1797 to 1801 he was a Federalist representative in Congress. During the War of 1812, he was a major general. He died in Charleston on November 2, 1828. The Pinckneys, like many other South Carolina revolutionary leaders, were of aristocratic birth and politics, closely connected with England by ties of blood, education, and business relations. This renders them more remarkable their attitude in the American Revolution, for which they made great sacrifices. On this day in history, January 13th, 1793, Nicolas Jean Hugon de Basseville, representative of revolutionary France, is lynched by a mob in Rome. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the diplomat. Nicolas Jean Hugon de Basseville, born 1753, died 1793, French journalist and diplomatist, was born at Abbeville, February 7, 1753. At the outbreak of the Revolution, he became editor of the Mercure International. Then, through the Girondist minister Lebrun Tondu, He entered the diplomatic service, went in May 1792 as Secretary of Legation to Naples, and was shortly afterwards sent, without official status, to Rome. His conduct in Rome, reflecting as it did his extreme revolutionary views, enraged the Roman populace. A riot broke out on January 13, 1793, and Basville, who was driving with his family to the Corso, was dragged from his carriage and so roughly handled that he died. The responsibility for the murder was laid by the Convention on the Pope. In 1797, by an article of the Treaty of Tolentino, the papal government agreed to pay 300 million francs to the French government as compensation. The poet Vincenzo Monti, in his epic Basvilliana, described the soul of Basville looking down on the revolutionary scene as a penance before entering paradise. Basville wrote Mémoires historiques, critiques et politiques sur la Révolution de France. On this day in history, January 14th, 1236, King Henry III of England marries Eleanor of Provence. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the king. Henry III, born 1207, died 1272. King of England, was the eldest son of King John by Isabella of Angoulême. Born on October 1st, 1207, the prince was but 9 years old at the time of his father's death. The greater part of eastern England being in the hands of the French pretender Louis, afterwards Louis VIII, and the rebel barons, Henry was crowned by his supporters at Gloucester, the western capital. John had committed his son to the protection of the Holy See, and a share in the government was accordingly allowed to the papal legates, Gulo and Pandolf, both during the Civil War and for some time afterwards. But the title of regent was given by the loyal barons to William Marshal, the aged Earl of Pembroke, and Peter de Roche, the Poitevin Bishop of Winchester, received the charge of the king's person. The cause of the young Henry was fully vindicated by the end of 1217, defeated both by land and sea. The French prince renounced his pretensions and evacuated England, leaving the regency to deal with the more difficult questions raised by the lawless insolence of the royal partisans. Henry remained a passive spectator of the measures by which William Marshal, died 1219, and his successor, the justiciar Hubert de Burgh, asserted the royal prerogative against native barons and foreign mercenaries. In 1223, Honorius III declared the king of age, but this was a mere formality, intended to justify the resumption of the royal castles and domains which had passed into private hands during the Civil War. The personal rule of Henry III began in 1227 when he was again proclaimed of age. Even then he remained for some time under the influence of Hubert de Burgh, whose chief rival, Peter de Roche, found it expedient to quit the kingdom for 4 years. But Henry was ambitious to recover the continental possessions which his father had lost. Against the wishes of the justiciar, he planned and carried out an expedition to the west of France, 1230, and, when it failed, laid the blame upon his minister. Other differences arose soon afterwards. Hubert was accused, with some reason, of enriching himself at the expense of the crown, and of encouraging popular riots against the alien clerks for whom the papacy was providing at the expense of the English church. He was disgraced in 1232, and the power passed for a time into the hands of Peter de Roche, who filled the administration with Poitevins. So began the period of misrule by which Henry III is chiefly remembered. The Poitevins fell in 1234. They were removed at the demand of the barons and the primate Edmund Rich, who held them responsible for the tragic fate of the rebellious Richard Marshal. But the king replaced them with a new clique of servile and rapacious favorites. Disregarding the wishes of the Great Council, and excluding all the more important of the barons and bishops from office, he acted as his own chief minister, and never condensed to justify his policy except when he stood in need of subsidies. When these were refused, he extorted aids from the towns, the Jews, or the clergy, the three most defenseless bodies in the kingdom. Always in pecuniary straits through his extravagance, he pursued a foreign policy which would have been expensive under the most careful management. He hoped not only to regain the French possessions, but to establish members of his own family as sovereigns in Italy and the Empire. These plans were artfully fostered by the Savoyard kinsman of Eleanor, daughter of Raymond Berenger, Count of Provence, whom he married at Canterbury on January 14, 1236. and his half-brothers, the sons of Queen Isabella and Hugo, Count of La Manche. These favorites, not content with pushing their fortunes in the English court, encouraged the king in the wildest designs. In 1242 he led an expedition to Gascony, which terminated disastrously with the defeat of Trelleborg, and hostilities with France were intermittently continued for 17 years. The Savoyards encouraged his natural tendency to support the papacy against the empire. Early in the period of misrule, he entered into a close alliance with Rome, which resulted in heavy taxation of the clergy, and gave great umbrage to the barons. A cardinal legate was sent to England at Henry's request, and, during 4 years, 1237-41, administered the English church in a manner equally profitable to the king and the pope. After the recall of the legate Otho, the alliance was less open and less cordial. Still, the pope continued to share the spoils of the English clergy with the king, and the king to enforce the demands of the Roman tax collectors. Circumstances favored Henry's schemes. Archbishop Edmund Rich was timid and inexperienced. His successor, Boniface of Savoy, was a kinsman of the queen. Grosseteste, the most eminent of the bishops, died in 1253 when he was on the point of becoming a popular hero. Among the lay barons, the first place naturally belonged to Richard of Cornwall, who, as the king's brother, was unwilling to take any steps which might impair the royal prerogative, while Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, the ablest man of his order, was regarded with suspicion as a foreigner, and linked to Henry's cause by his marriage with the Princess Eleanor. Although the Great Council repeatedly protested against the king's misrule and extravagance, their remonstrances came to nothing for want of leaders and a clear-cut policy. But between 1248 and 1252, Henry alienated Montfort from his cause by taking the side of the Gascons, whom the earl had provoked to rebellion through his rigorous administration of their duchy. A little later, when Montfort was committed to opposition, Henry foolishly accepted from Innocent IV the crown of Sicily for his second son, Edmund Crouchback, 1255. Sicily was to be conquered from the Hohenstaufen at the expense of England, and Henry pledged his credit to the papacy for enormous subsidies, although years of comparative inactivity had already overwhelmed him with debts. On the publication of the ill-considered bargain, the baronage at length took vigorous action. They forced upon the king the provisions of Oxford, 1258, which placed the government in the hands of a feudal oligarchy. They reduced expenditure, expelled the alien favorites from the kingdom, and insisted upon a final renunciation of the French claims. The king submitted for the moment, but at the first opportunity endeavored to cancel his confessions. He obtained a papal absolution from his promises, and he tricked the opposition into accepting the arbitration of the French king Louis IX, whose verdict was a foregone conclusion, but Henry was incapable of protecting with the strong hand the rights which he had recovered by his double-dealing. Ignominiously defeated by Montfort at Luz, 1264, he fell into the position of a cipher, equally despised by his opponents and supporters. He acquiesced in the earl's dictatorship, left to his eldest son, Edward, the difficult task of reorganizing the royal party, marched with the Montfortians to Evesham, and narrowly escaped sharing the fate of his jailer. After Evesham, 1265, he is hardly mentioned by the chroniclers. The compromise with the surviving rebels was arranged by his son in the concert with Richard of Cornwall and the legate Addobuono. The Statute of Marlborough, 1267, which purchased a lasting peace by judicious concessions, was similarly arranged between Edward and the Earl of Gloucester. Edward was king in all but name for some years before the death of his father, by whom he was alternatively suspected and adored. Henry had in him some of the elements of a fine character. His mind was cultivated. He was a discriminating patron of literature, and Westminster Abbey is an abiding memorial of his artistic taste. His personal morality was irreproachable, except that he inherited the Plantagenet taste for crooked courses and dissimulation in political affairs. Even in this respect, the king's reputation has suffered unduly at the hands of Matthew Paris, whose literary skill is only equaled by his malice. The ambitions which Henry cherished, if extravagant, were never sordid. His patriotism, though seldom attested by practical measures, was thoroughly sincere. Some of his worst actions as a politician were due to a sincere, though exaggerated, gratitude for the support which the papacy had given him during his minority. But he had neither the training nor the temper of a statesman. His dreams of autocracy at home and far-reaching dominion abroad were anachronisms in a century of constitutional ideas and national differentiation. Above all, he earned the contempt of Englishmen and foreigners alike by the instability of his purpose. Matthew Paris said that he had a heart of wax. Dante relegated him to the limbo of ineffectual souls, and later generations have endorsed these scathing judgments. Henry died at Westminster on November 16, 1272. His widow, Eleanor, took the veil in 1276, and died at Amesbury on June 25, 1291. Their children were the future King Edward I, Edward, Earl of Lancaster, Margaret, 1240-75, wife of Alexander III of Scotland, Beatrice, and Catherine. On this day in history, January 15th, 69 AD, Otho seizes power in Rome, proclaiming himself Emperor of Rome, beginning a reign of only 3 months. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the emperor. Marcus Salvius Otho, born 32 AD, died 69. Roman emperor, was born on April 28, 32 AD. He appears first as one of the wildest of Nero's court. In 58, he refused to divorce his wife Poppaea Sabina at Nero's bidding, and was thereupon sent to be governor of Lusitania, where he remained 10 years. In 68, Galba, governor of the neighboring province of Tarraconensis, rebelled against Nero, and Otho accompanied him to Rome, hoping to succeed him. In January 69, Galba adopted Piso as his successor, and Otho at once organized a revolt of the Praetorian Guard, and on January 15th had himself proclaimed emperor, murdered Galba and Piso, and was accepted by the Senate. He owed his success partly to Galba's disciplinary measures being unpopular with the guards, partly to the power of the memory of Nero, which he further enlisted by restoring his statues and officials of his household, and proposing to complete his palace, the Golden House. News soon arrived, however, that the army in Germany had declared for Vitellius. On March 14th he started northwards to prevent the Vitellians entering Italy. In this he failed, but his advance guard successfully defended Placentia against Alenius Caecina, compelling him to retire to Cremona, and he held the line on the Po. Opinions were divided in Otho's camp, he himself wishing to force a decisive battle, others advising him to wait for the arrival of the troops from Dalmatia. Otho prevailed, and the main army crossed the Po to Bedrachium, Otho staying behind with the reserve at Brixillum on the southern bank. The Othoian forces were defeated outside Cremona, and deserted to the enemy. Otho refused to renew the struggle, and committed suicide in his tent on the morning of April 15th, 69, and was buried at Brixellum. On this day in history, January 16th, 1458 BC, Hatshepsut dies at the age of 50 and is buried in the Valley of the Kings. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the Queen. Hatshepsut, or Hatshepsut, Floret, 1500 BC. Egyptian queen, daughter of Thutmose I, sister and queen of the short-reigned Thutmose II, after whose death she secured the crown, in spite of opposition from the future Thutmose III, who was the son either of Thutmose I or of Thutmose II. She acquired fame by her magnificent terrace temple at Deir al-Bahri, and by her obelisks at Thebes, the expenses of which were partly met by the treasure-hunting expeditions which she sent to South Arabia. The long military inactivity of her reign, during which state affairs were in the hands of her partisans, shook Egyptian power in Asia. In 1841 her tomb was discovered on a cliff behind the Valley of the King's Tomb. Her successor, Thutmose III, had her name and figure cut off of the sculptures in her temple and treated the remains of her partisans in a similar manner. On this day in history, January 17th, 38 BC, Octavian divorces his wife Scribonia and marries Livia Drusilla, ending the fragile peace between the Second Triumvirate and Sextus Pompey. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Empress. Livia Drusilla, born circa 55 BC, died 29 AD. Roman Empress, was originally the wife of Tiberius Claudius Nero, by whom she had 2 sons, Drusus and Tiberius, afterwards emperor. In 38, Augustus compelled her husband to divorce her and married her himself, having first got rid of his own wife Scribonia. Her 2 sons were entrusted to the guardianship of Augustus, to whom she bore no children. Livia was suspected of committing various crimes to secure the throne for Tiberius: the premature deaths of Augustus's nephew Marcellus, whom he had at first fixed upon as his successor, and of his grandsons Gaius and Lucius Caesar. The banishment of his grandson Agrippa Postumus, and even his own death, were attributed to her. Augustus, by his will, declared her and Tiberius, whom he had adopted in 4 AD, his heirs. Livia inherited a third of his property. She was adopted into the Julian gens, and henceforth assumed the name of Julia Augusta. She had now reached the summit of her ambition, and at first acted as joint ruler with Tiberius. Tiberius, however, soon became tired of her control. His retirement to Capraea is said to have been caused by his desire to escape from her. Livia continued to live quietly at Rome in the full enjoyment of authority until her death at an advanced age. On this day in history, January 18th, 1486, King Henry VII of England marries Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, uniting the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the king. Henry VII, born 1457, died 1509. King of England, great-great-grandson of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, whose issue born before their marriage had been legitimated by Parliament, was the first Tudor king. He was the son of Edmund, Earl of Richmond, and Margaret Beaufort, only daughter of John, Duke of Somerset, and was born in Pembroke Castle on January 28, 1457, 2 months after his father's death. During the reign of Edward IV, the child Henry was hidden in various castles until his uncle Jasper took him to Brittany. There he was joined by many Englishmen driven abroad by the cruelties of Richard III. An invasion of England was planned in 1483 in concert with the Duke of Buckingham's rising, but stormy weather defeated the movement. A second expedition, 2 years later, aided this time by France, was successful. Henry landed at Milford Haven among the Welsh allies and defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth, August 22, 1485. He was crowned at Westminster on October 30th, and in fulfillment of pledges to his Yorkist supporters, married Elizabeth, 1465 to 1503. Eldest daughter and heiress of Edward IV, January 18, 1486, whose 2 brothers had been murdered by Richard III. Thus the red and white roses were united, and the pretext for civil war done away with. Nevertheless, Henry's reign was much disturbed by a succession of Yorkist conspiracies. Of the 2 most notable impostors, the first, Lambert Simnel, impersonated the Earl of Warwick, son of the Duke of Clarence, but the rebellion in his favor was put down at the Battle of Stoke, near Newark, June 16, 1487. This movement had been greatly assisted by the Irish and by Margaret, Duchess Dowager of Burgundy, sister of Edward IV. The second pretender, Perkin Warbeck, who impersonated 1492 Richard, Duke of York, one of the princes murdered in the Tower, was also much indebted to foreign support. Anxious as Henry was to avoid foreign wars, he was committed to war with France, partly by his desire of an alliance with Spain, and partly by desire to prevent the incorporation of Brittany with France. Moreover, the French king gave assistance to Perkin Warbeck. Henry gave Brittany defensive aid, but after the Duchess Anne had married Charles VIII of France, he felt bound to fulfill his obligations to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, and also to the German king Maximilian by an invasion of France in 1492. After besieging Boulogne for some time, he made peace with France at Etaples, November 3, 1492. Meanwhile, Margaret of Burgundy received Perkin Warbeck as her nephew, and Maximilian, now estranged from Henry, recognized him, 1494, as King of England. Perkin Warbeck attempted to land at Deal, but sailed to Ireland and then to Scotland, where James IV received him. November 1495, married him to an earl's daughter, and made a futile invasion, 1496, of England with him. But in 1497 he thought best to dismiss him, and Perkin, after an unsuccessful visit to Ireland, landed with a small body of men in Cornwall, where shortly before an insurrection on account of the taxation imposed by repelling the Scottish invasion had been put down. Perkin, after a futile siege of Exeter and advance to Taunton, took sanctuary at Beaulieu in Hampshire, and surrendered, September 1497. Imprisoned near the Earl of Warwick in the Tower, he inveigled that simple-minded youth into a project of escape. For this, both were executed 1499, and during the rest of Henry's reign, no further insurrections occurred. The king was now seeking alliances for his children. While the eldest, Arthur, was still an infant, a marriage had been proposed for him with Catherine, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon. Catherine was now brought to England, and they were married on November 14, 1501. On Arthur's death, in the following April, Catherine was betrothed to the king's second son, Henry. Meanwhile, Henry's eldest daughter, Margaret, was married, 1503, to James IV of Scotland, a match intended to confirm the Treaty of Peace signed in July 1499, and to make possible the ultimate union of England and Scotland, which actually resulted from it. Henry's queen died on February 11, 1503, and during the remainder of his reign he made fruitless proposals for a second marriage, proposals in which political objects were the chief consideration. In his latter years, the king became unpopular from the extortions practiced by his two instruments, Empson and Dudley, under the authority of antiquated statutes. From the beginning of his reign, he had accumulated money, mainly from his own security against intrigues and conspiracies, and avarice had grown upon him. When he died in April 1505, he was undoubtedly the richest prince in Christendom. Before his death, however, he had finished the hospital of the Savoy and made provision for the magnificent chapel at Westminster which bears his name. Henry not only terminated a disastrous civil war, put down the Scottish invasion, and reduced Ireland to obedience, but after the profitable Treaty of Oedipus, remained on good terms with France, with the Duchy of Brittany, and with Spain, and was able to mollify Maximilian. With Maximilian's son, the Archduke Philip, governor of the Netherlands, Henry made a special effort to keep peace because of the commercial advantages involved. With the papacy, also his diplomacy and orthodoxy kept him in friendly relations. During the 24 years of Henry's reign, only 7 parliaments met, the second one instituting the famous Court of the Star Chamber for the correction of irregularities in the administration of justice due to the breakdown of the jury system. The question of wages, hours of labor, and standards of commerce and manufacture were also taken up by Parliament, and internal trade became less local. When Henry died, his position was strong both in England and on the continent. On this day in history, January 19th, 1419, as part of the 100 Years' War, Rouen surrenders to Henry V of England, completing his reconquest of Normandy. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Rotuma, or Rotumacos, the Celtic name of Rouen, was modified by the Romans into Rotomagus, and by the writers of medieval Latin into Rodomum, of which the present name is a corruption. Under Caesar and the early emperors, the town was the capital of the Veliocassus, and it did not attain to any eminence till it was made the center of Lugdunensis Secunda at the close of the 3rd century, and a little later the seat of an archbishop. Rouen owed much to its first bishops, from St. Mello, the apostle of the region, who flourished about 260, to St. Remigius, who died in 772. Under Louis le Debonair and his successors, the Normans several times sacked the city, but under the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte in 912, Rouen became the capital of Normandy and the principal residence of the dukes. In 1087, William the Conqueror, mortally wounded at Mantes, died at Rouen. The succeeding Norman kings of England tended to neglect Rouen in favor of Caen, and afterwards of Poitiers, Le Mans, and Angers. But it maintained an importance during the 12th century, indicated by the building of churches, notably that of St. Owen. In 1203, Rouen was the scene of the murder of Arthur of Brittany at the hands of King John of England. Ostensibly to avenge the crime, Philip Augustus invaded Normandy and entered the capital unopposed. Philip confirmed its communal privileges and built a new castle. A convention between the merchants of Rouen and those of Paris relating to the navigation of the Seine was followed by treaties with London, with the Hanseatic towns, and with Flanders and Champagne. In 1302, the seat of the Exchequer of Sovereign Court, afterwards the Parliament, of Normandy was definitely fixed at Rouen. A stubborn resistance was offered to Henry V of England, who, after a long siege, occupied the town in 1419. The prosperity of Rouen continued under the English domination. In 1431, Joan of Arc was tried and burned in the city. From the year the French began attempts to recapture the town, which they did in 1449. During the close of the 15th century and the first half of the 16th, Rouen was a metropolis of art and taste. In 1562, the town was sacked by the Protestants. This did not prevent the League from gaining so firm a footing there that Henry IV besieged it unsuccessfully and only obtained entrance after his abjuration. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 greatly affected Rouen. During the Franco-German War, the city was occupied by the invaders from December 1870 till July 1871. In World War I, Rouen played a great part in the supporting organization of the British Army in France. During World War II, fierce fighting took place in the area, and the town was occupied by the Germans in June 1940. On this day in history, January 20th, 1488, Sebastian Munster, German scholar, cartographer, and cosmographer, is born. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the man. Sebastian Munster, born 1489, died 1552, German geographer, mathematician, and Hebraist, was born in Ingelheim in the Palatine. He entered the Franciscan order, but adopted Lutheranism about 1529, and was appointed court preacher at Heidelberg. From 1536 he taught at Basel, where he published his Cosmographia Universalis in 1544, and where he died of the plague on May 23, 1552. He was the first German to edit the Hebrew Bible, 2 volumes, folio, Basel, 1534-35. His most important work was his Cosmographia, which also appeared in German as Beschreibung aller Länder, the first detailed scientific and popular description of the world in German. In this, Munster was assisted by more than 120 collaborators. The most valued edition of the Cosmographia, or Beschreibung, is that of 1550, especially prized for its portraits and its city and costume pictures. Besides the works mentioned above, we may notice Munster's Germanae Descriptio of 1530, his Novus Orbis of 1532, his Mappa Europa of 1536, his Ratia of 1538, his editions of Solinus, Mela, and Ptolemy in 1538-40, his Horologiographia, 1531, on dialing, his Organum Uranicum of 1536 on the planetary motions, and his Rudimenta Mathematica of 1551. On this day in history, January 21st, 1774, Abdul Hamid I becomes Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and Caliph of Islam. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Sultan. Abdul Hamid I, born 1725, died 1789. Sultan of Turkey, son of Ahmed III, succeeded his brother Mustafa III in 1773, and died on April 7, 1789. On this day in history, January 22nd, 1849, as part of the Second Anglo-Sikh War, the Siege of Multan ends after 9 months when the last Sikh defenders of Multan, Punjab, surrender. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Multan, or Multan, a city, district, and division of British India in the Punjab. The city is 4 miles from the left bank of the Chenab, near the ancient confluence of the Ravi with that river. Population from 1931, 119,457. The city is enclosed on 3 sides by a wall, but large and irregular suburbs have grown up outside the wall. The principal buildings in the fort include the shrines of 2 Mohammedan saints and an ancient Hindu temple. The cantonments form the headquarters of a brigade. Multan has manufactures of carpets, silk and cotton goods, shoes, glazed pottery, and enamel work, and an annual horse fair. It is moreover one of the most important trade centers in the Punjab. The district of Multan occupies the lower angle of the Bari Dohab, or tract between the Setluj and the Chenab, with an extension over the Ravi, area 5,892 square miles. The population in 1931 was 1,174,900. The principal crops are wheat, millet, pulse, oil seeds, cotton, and indigo.
There are factories for ginning and pressing cotton. Indigo is made only by the native processes. Irrigation was till recently conducted only by inundation canals from the boundary rivers, but there is now a large area irrigated from the lower Bari Doab permanent canal. The heat of Multan is notorious. The early Arab geographers mention Multan as forming part of the kingdom of the Sind, which was conquered for the caliphate of Muhammad bin Qasim in the middle of the 8th century. On the dismemberment of the Mughal Empire in the middle of the 18th century, Multan fell to the Afghans, who held it with difficulty against the Sikhs. At length, in 1818, Ranjit Singh, after a long siege, carried the capital by storm, and in 1821 he made over the administration of Multan with 5 neighboring districts to Sawan Mal, who raised the province to a state of prosperity by excavating canals and inducing new inhabitants to settle. After the establishment of the Council of Regency of Lahore, difficulties arose between Moraj, son and successor of Sawan Mal, and the British officials, which led to his rebellion and culminated in the Second Sikh War and the annexation of the whole of Punjab. The city of Multan, after a stubborn defense, was captured in January 1849. The district at once passed under direct British rule, and order was not disturbed even during the mutiny. On this day in history, January 23, 1229, the episcopal seat is moved from Nuzianen to Koroyanen, located near the current center of Turku, by the permission of Pope Gregory IX. The date is starting to be considered as the founding of Turku. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the port. Turku, a seaport of Finland on the Gulf of Bothnia. Population estimated from 1939, 74,351. It is the second largest town in Finland and has a shipbuilding and repairing industry. An icebreaker keeps the port open throughout the winter. There are 4 entrances to the harbor, with lighthouses for each, and there are 4 patent slips capable of taking vessels up to 1,200 tons. The chief imports are salt, saltfish, pig iron, oils, coal, cotton, machinery, and colonial goods, and the exports timber, grain, butter, bar iron, pork, beef, and game. There is a considerable coasting trade. After the Diet of Borga in 1809, Turku became the capital of the Russian Grand Duchy of Finland, but in 1819 the government was moved to Helsinki. It was founded in 1229 and has been a center of Swedish culture, having a Swedish as well as a Finnish college. On this day in history, January 24th, 41 AD, Claudius is proclaimed Roman Emperor by the Praetorian Guard after they assassinate the previous emperor, his nephew Caligula. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the emperor. Claudius. Tiberius Claudius Drusus Nero Germanicus, Roman Emperor from 41 AD to 54, son of Drusus and Antonina, nephew of the Emperor Tiberius, and grandson of Livia, the wife of Augustus, was born at Lugdunum, Lyon, on August 4th, 10 BC. He was kept in the background by Augustus Tiberius, owing to his physical infirmities and apparent weakness of intellect, and lived in retirement. It was probably at this time that he became dependent on the company of freedmen. Under Caligula, he became more prominent, holding the consulship, 37 AD, and other public posts, though he was the emperor's butt. Many people at Rome must have realized that he might succeed. On the murder of Caligula, Claudius, though not of the Julian gens, was made emperor by the Praetorians, who were rewarded with a large donative and were probably increased in number. Claudius, though abnormal, was by no means the idiot that our hostile sources would suggest. Despite his pedantry, he had a certain shrewdness and wished to govern well. In the earlier part of his reign, he extended the boundaries of the empire. Mauretania was subdued and annexed in 43, and in the same year Claudius himself took part in the famous expedition to Britain, which gave the Romans a footing in the south of the island. In 44, Judea, which had been entrusted to King Agrippa, was made once more a province, and in 46 the same fate overtook the client kingdom of Thrace. In his dealings with the provincials, Claudius, despite senatorial opposition, reverted to Julius Caesar's liberal policy. We possess part of this speech proposing that the chieftains of the Aedawi should be admitted to the Senate, and his edict conferring citizenship on the Anuani. A large number of municipa and colonies in the provinces owe their origins to Claudius. The reign of Claudius is marked by the development of the emperor's personal service. There was an extension of procuratorial government in the provinces, i.e. Thrace, Mauritania, and Judea, and the provincial procurators were granted jurisdiction equal to that of the emperor in all cases relating to the fiscus. A definite scale of salaries was also instituted, but even more notable was the increased power of the emperor's freedmen, who, while they remained his personal servants, became, in practice, powerful ministers and received great rewards and honor. The rule of the freedmen, who, though efficient, were arrogant and corrupt, was resented by the nobility, but the practice was continued under later emperors, though not to the same extent. Another grievance was the increased importance of the emperor's private court. Under Augustus and Tiberius, its use had been restricted to certain cases of majestas, but Claudius had a passion for acting as judge. Vast numbers of cases were heard in camera, and the emperor's methods seem often to have been capricious. His public works include a new harbor at Ostia, the draining of the Fucine Lake, and the construction of 2 aqueducts, Aqua Claudia and Anio Novus. His reveal of the censorship and extension of the poemarium may be quoted rather as examples of his antiquarianism than as practically important. In 47 he celebrated the Ludis Seculares. In the latter part of his reign, his government degenerated, and he fell entirely under the influence of his favorites and his womankind. He had married, as his third wife, Messalina, who, in 47, if we are to believe Tacitus, actually went through a form of marriage with Silius, unknown to Claudius. Narcissus brought about her execution, and at the prompting of Pallas, the E Nationibus, Claudius married his niece Agrippina, a marriage which shocked Roman sentiment. She induced him to set aside his own son, Britannicus, and to adopt as her heir Nero, her son by a former marriage. Claudius died suddenly in 54, poisoned, according to Tacitus, by Agrippina. He was deified, but Seneca's attire, the Apocalyptos, expresses the relief felt at his death. Claudius wrote several historical works, magis inepte quam ineleganter, including his own autobiography, but all, unfortunately, are lost. On this day in history, January 25th, 1533, Henry VIII of England secretly marries his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Queen. Anne Boleyn, or Boleyn, born circa 1507, died 1536, Queen of Henry VIII of England, daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn, afterwards Earl of Wiltshire and Ormond, and of Elizabeth, daughter of Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, afterwards Duke of Norfolk, was born according to Camden in 1507, but an earlier date, 1502 or 1501, is given by some later writers. She visited France with her father about 1519 and was attached to the service of Queen Claude for a short time. She returned in 1521 or 1522 to England. Among her admirers was the poet Sir Thomas Wyatt, and among her definite suitors was Henry Percy, heir of the Earl of Northumberland. A series of grants and favors bestowed by Henry on her father between 1522 and 1525 have been regarded, with little justification, as a symptom of the king's affections. Anne, however, had no intention of being the king's mistress. She meant to be his queen. There is no absolute proof that Henry's passion was anterior to the proceedings taken for the divorce in May 1527, the celebrated love letters being undated. After the king's final separation from his wife in July 1531, Anne accompanied Henry on the visit to Francis I in 1532, while Catherine was left at home, neglected and practically a prisoner. Henry married her about January 25, 1533. The exact date is unknown, their union not being made public till the following Easter. Subsequently, on May 28th, their marriage was declared valid, and that with Catherine null, and in June Anne was crowned at Westminster Hall. A weak, giddy woman of no stability of character, her success turned her head and caused her to behave with insolence and impropriety, in strong contrast with Catherine's quiet dignity under her misfortunes. She, and not the king, probably was the author of the petty persecution inflicted upon Catherine and upon the Princess Mary, and her jealousy of the latter showed itself in spiteful malice. She incurred the remonstrances of the Privy Council and alienated her own friends and relations. But there were soon signs that Henry's affection, which had before been a genuine passion, had cooled or ceased. He resented her arrogance, and a few months after the marriage he gave her cause for jealousy, and disputes arose. Fate had prepared Anne for the same domestic griefs that had ruined Catherine. In September 1533, the birth of a daughter, afterwards Queen Elizabeth, instead of the long-hoped-for son, was a heavy disappointment. Next year there was a miscarriage, and on January 29, 1536, the day of Catherine's funeral, she gave birth to a dead male child. On May 1st, it became known that several of Anne's reputed lovers had been arrested. On the 2nd, Anne herself was committed to the Tower on a charge of adultery with various persons, including her own brother, Lord Rochford. On the 12th, Sir Francis Weston, Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Mark Smeaton were declared guilty of high treason, while Anne herself and Lord Rochford were condemned unanimously by an assembly of 26 peers on the 15th. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, persisted as Lord Steward, and gave sentence, weeping, that his niece was to be burned or beheaded, as pleased the king. Her former lover, the Earl of Northumberland, left the court, seized with a sudden illness. Her father had declared his conviction of his daughter's guilt at the trial of her reputed lovers. On the 16th, Anne informed Cranmer of a certain supposed impediment to her marriage with the king, according to some accounts a previous marriage with Northumberland, though the latter solemnly and positively denied it, which was never disclosed, but was pronounced on the 17th sufficient to invalidate her marriage. The same day all her reputed lovers were executed, and on the 19th she herself suffered death on Tower Green, her head being struck off with a sword by the executioner of Calais, brought to England for the purpose. She had regarded the prospect of death with courage and almost with levity, laughing heartily as she put her hands about her little neck and recalled the skill of the executioner. "I have seen many men," wrote Sir William Kingston, governor of the Tower, "and also women executed, and all they have been in great sorrow, and to my knowledge this lady has much joy and pleasure in death." On the following day Henry was betrothed to Jane Seymour. Anne Boleyn's guilt remains unproved. To Sir William Kingston he protested her entire innocence, and on the scaffold, while expressing her submission, she made no confession. A principal witness for the charge of incest with Rochford's own wife, a woman of infamous character afterwards executed for complicity in the intrigues of Catherine Howard. The discovery of Anne's misdeeds coincided in an extraordinary manner with Henry's disappointment in not obtaining by her a male heir, while the king's despotic power and the universal unpopularity of Anne both tended to hinder the administration of pure justice. But it is almost incredible that two grand juries, a petty jury, and a tribunal consisting of nearly all the lay peers of England, with the evidence before them, which we do not now possess, should have all unanimously passed a sentence of guilt contrary to the facts and their convictions, and that such a sentence should have been supported by Anne's own father and uncle. Anne is described as not one of the handsomest women in the world. She is of middling stature, swarthy complexion, long neck, wide mouth, bosom not much raised, and in fact has nothing but the English king's great appetite, and her eyes, which are black and beautiful, and take great effect. On this day in history, January 26, 1564, the Council of Trent establishes an official distinction between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the Council. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, has a long antecedent history of great significance for the fortunes of the Catholic Church. During the 15th and earlier half of the 16th century, the conception of an ecumenical council remained an ideal of which the realization was expected to provide a solution for the serious ecclesiastical difficulties which were then prevalent. The Emperor Charles V urged on the papacy the necessity of convening a general assembly of the Church. The passive resistance of the Curia was so stubborn that the decisive step was postponed time and again, but the goal was finally attained, and this result was a work of Charles, aided by three powerful cardinals. The bull, Laeter Jerusalem, November 19, 1544, fixed the meeting of the council for March 15, 1545, in Trent and assigned it three tasks. 1. The pacification of the religious dispute by doctrinal decisions. 2. The reform of ecclesiastical abuses. 3. The discussion of a crusade against the infidels. The opening of the council was deferred once again. Towards the end of May 1545, 20 bishops were collected at Trent, but there was no sign of action, and the papal legates, Del Monte, Corvinus, and Reginald Pole, delayed the inauguration, the emperor and the pope being at cross purposes as to procedure. In the eyes of Paul III, the council was simply the means by which he expected to secure a condemnation of the Protestant heresy, in hopes that he would then be in a position to impose the sentence of the Church upon them by force. For him, the question of ecclesiastical reform possessed no interest whatever. In contrast to this, Charles demanded that these very reforms should be given precedence, and the decisions on points of dogma postponed till he should have compelled the Protestants to send representatives to the council. The Pope, however, alarmed by the threat of a colloquy in Germany, at last ordered the synod to be opened, December 13, 1545. The procedure adopted secured the predominance of the Roman chair from the first, as the voting was not to be by nations, as at Constance, but by individuals. The last word remained with the Italians, who were in the majority. The council began its work in the region of dogma by defining the doctrines of the Church with reference to the most important controversial points, a procedure which frustrated the emperor's hopes for a reconciliation with the Protestants. The doctrines dealt with, up to March 1547, were the Holy Scriptures and tradition, original sin, justification, and the sacraments in general, and baptism and confirmation in particular. In March, the council was moved to Bologna, on the pretext that an epidemic was raging in Trent, though, at the imperial command, part of the bishops remained behind. But on the 2nd of June, the Council of Bologna resolved to adjourn its labors. At the Diet of Augsburg, the emperor secured a modus vivendi, leavened by the Catholic spirit between the adherents of either religion, and this provisionary settlement, the so-called Interim of Augsburg, was promulgated as law of the empire, June 3, 1548, and declared binding till the council should reassemble. But the confusion of ecclesiastical affairs had grown worse, confounded through the refusal of the Pope to continue the council, when his death, November 10, 1549, changed the situation. Pope Julius III, the former legate Del Monte, caused the council to resume its labors on May 1, 1551, under the presidency of Cardinal Crescentio. The personnel was, for the most part, different, and the new members included the Jesuits, Lainez, and Salmeron. The French clergy had not a single delegate, while the Spanish bishops maintained an independent attitude under the aegis of the emperor, and Protestant deputies were on this occasion required to appear at Trent. Their participation, however, was useless, for the discussion of doctrine on the basis of Holy Writ was from the Catholic standpoint impossible, and the revolt of the Elector Maurice of Saxony, March 20, 1552, compelled the emperor to leave Innsbruck and dissolve the conclave. Its dogmatic labors were confined to doctrinal decrees on the Lord's Supper, and on the sacraments of penance and extreme unction. On April 28, 1552, the sittings were suspended. 10 years elapsed before the council reassembled for the third time in Trent. During the intervening period, the religious problem in Germany had received such a solution as the times admitted by the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, and the equality there guaranteed between the Protestant estates and the Catholic estates had left the former nothing to hope from a council. The incitement to continue the council came from another quarter. It was no longer anxiety with regard to Protestantism that excited the pressure, but a growing conviction of the imperative need of more stringent reforms within the Catholic Church itself. In France and Spain, the very countries where the Protestant heresy had been most vigorously combated, a great mass of discontent had accumulated, and France already showed a strong inclination to attempt an independent settlement of her ecclesiastical difficulties in a national council. Pius IV, therefore, announced, November 29, 1560, the convocation of the council, and on January 18, 1562, it was actually reopened. The Protestants, indeed, were also invited by the evangelical princes, assembled in Nuremberg, within their assent. To secure freedom of action, France and the Emperor Ferdinand required that it should rank as a new council. Pius IV, however, designated it a continuation of the earlier meetings. Ferdinand, in addition to the regulations for the amendment of the clergy and the monastic system, demanded above all the legalization of the marriage of the priesthood, while France and Spain laid stress on the recognition of the divine right of the episcopate and its independence with regard to the Pope. In consequence of these reformatory aspirations, the position of the Pope and the Council was for a while full of peril, but the papal diplomacy, by concessions, threats, and by exploiting political and ecclesiastical dissensions, broke the force of the attack. In the third period of the Council, which, as a result of these feuds, witnessed no session from September 1562 to July 1563, doctrinal resolutions were also passed concerning the Lord's Supper, sub outrage specie, the sacrifice of the Mass, the sacrament of the ordination, the worship of saints, relics, and images. On December 4th, 1563, the synod was closed. The dogmatic decisions of the Council of Trent make no attempt at embracing the whole doctrinal system of the Roman Catholic Church, but present a selection of the most vital doctrines, partly chosen as a counterblast to Protestantism, and formulated throughout with a view to that creed and its objections. The reformatory enactments touch on numerous phases of ecclesiastical life: administration, discipline, appointment to spiritual offices, the marriage law, decretum de reformatione matrimoni, temezi, the duties of the clergy, and so forth. The resolutions include many that marked an advance, but for the opportunity for a comprehensive and thorough reformation of the life of the Church, the necessity of which was recognized in the Catholic Church itself, was not embraced. No alteration of the abuses which obtained in the Curia was effected, and no annulment of the customs so lucrative to that body and deleterious to others was attempted. The Council of Trent, in fact, enjoyed only a certain appearance of independence, for the freedom of speech which had been accorded was exercised under the supervision of papal legates, who maintained a decisive influence over the proceedings and could count on a certain majority in consequence of the overwhelming number of Italians. That the synod figured as the responsible author of its own decrees, Sancta Occlumentia et Generalis Tridentia Synodas in Spiritual Sancto Legitime Congregata, proves very little, since the following clause reads Presentibus Apostolicae Sedis Legatis, while the legates and the Pope expressly refused to sanction an application of the words of the Council of Constance, Universalem Ecclesiam Representans. The whole course of the council was determined by the presupposition that it had no autonomous standing, and that its labors were simply transacted under the commission and guidance of the Pope. This was not merely a claim put forward by the Roman See at the time. It was acknowledged by the attitude of the synod throughout. The legates confirmed the right of discussion to the subjects propounded by the Pope, and their position was that he was in no way bound by the vote of the majority. In difficult cases, the synod itself left the decision to him, and in question of clandestine marriages and the administration of the Lord's Supper sub outrage specie. Further, at the close of the sessions, a resolution was adopted, by the terms of which all the enactments of the Council de Morum Reformation atque Ecclesiastica Disciplina were subject to the limitation that the papal authority should not be prejudiced thereby. Every doubt as to the papal supremacy is removed when we consider that the Tridentine Fathers sought for all their enactments and decisions the ratification confirmatio of the Pope, which was conferred by Pious IV in the bull Benedictus Deus, January 26, 1564. And in its last meeting, the synod transferred to the Pope a number of tasks for which their own time had proved inadequate. These comprised the compilation of a catalogue of forbidden books, a catechism, a short concepticus of the Articles of Faith, and an edition of the Missal and the Breviary. Thus the Council presented the Holy See with a further opportunity of expanding its influence and diffusing its views. The 10 rules De Liberis Prohibitus were published in March 1564. The Professio Fidei Tridentine in November 1564, and the Catechismus et Decreto Concilii Tridentini ad Parachos, early in 1568. The ecumenical character of the council was never seriously questioned. On the motion of the legates, the resolutions were submitted to the ambassadors of the secular powers for signature, the French and Spanish envoys alone withholding their assent. The recognition of the council's enactments was, nonetheless, beset with difficulties. So far as the doctrinal decisions were concerned, no obstacles existed, but the reformatory edicts, adhesion to which was equally required by the Synod, stood on a different footing. In their character of resolutions claiming to rank as ecclesiastical law, they came into conflict with outside interests, and their acceptance by no means implied that the rights of the sovereign or the needs and circumstances of the representative countries were treated with sufficient consideration. The consequence was that there arose an active and, in some cases, a tenacious opposition to an indiscriminate acquiescence in all the Tridentine decrees, especially in France, where only those regulations were recognized which came into collision neither with the rights of the king nor with the liberties of the Galician Church. In Spain, Philip II allowed indeed the publication of the Tridentium, but always with the reservation that the privileges of the king, his vassals, and his subjects should not thereby be infringed. In his official confirmation, Pius IV had already strictly prohibited any commentary on the enactments of the council unless undertaken with his approval, and had claimed for himself the sole right of interpretation. In order to supervise the practical working of these enactments, Pius created, 1564, a special department of the Curia, the Congresio Cardinalum Concilii Tridentum Interpretum, and to this body Sixtus V entrusted the further task of determining the sense of the conciliar decisions in all dubious cases, the resolutions of the congregation on disputed points, and their declarations on legal questions exercised a powerful influence on later development of ecclesiastical law. The Council of Trent attained a quite extraordinary significance for the Roman Catholic Church, and its preeminence was unassailed till the Vaticanum subordinated all the labors of the Church in the past, whether in the region of doctrine or in that of law, to an infallible pope. On the theological side, it fixed the results of medieval scholasticism and drew from it all that could be of service to the Church. Further, by pronouncing on a series of doctrinal points till then undecided, it elaborated the Catholic Creed, and finally, the bold front which offered to Protestantism in its presentation of the Orthodox faith gave to its members the practical lead they so much needed in their resistance to the evangelical assault. It showed that Church as a living institution, capable of work and achievement. It strengthened the confidence both of her members and herself, and it was a powerful factor in heightening her efficiency as a competitor with Protestantism and in restoring and reinforcing her imperiled unity. Indeed, its sphere of influence was still more extensive, for its labors in the field of dogma and ecclesiastical law conditioned the future evolution of the Roman Catholic Church. On this day in history, January 27th, 1571, Abbas I of Persia is born. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the Shah. Abbas I, born circa 1557, died 1628 or 1629. Shah of Persia, called the Great, was the son of Shah Muhammad, died 1586. In the midst of a general anarchy in Persia, he was proclaimed ruler of Khorasan and became Shah in 1586. Determined to raise the fallen fortunes of his country, he first directed his efforts against the predatory Uzbegs, who occupied and harassed Khorasan. After a long struggle, he regained Meshed, defeated them in a great battle near Herat in 1597, and drove them out of his dominions. In the wars he carried on with the Turks, during nearly the whole of his reign, he acquired, or regained, a large extent of territory. By the victory he gained at Basra in 1605, he extended his empire beyond the Euphrates. Sultan Ahmed I was forced to cede Shirvan and Kurdistan in 1611. The united armies of the Turks and Tartars were completely defeated near Sultanak in 1618, and Abbas made peace on very favorable terms, and on the Turks renewing the war. Baghdad fell into the hands after a year's siege in 1623. In 1622, he took the island of Ormuz from the Portuguese by the assistance of the British, and much of its trade was diverted to the town of Bandar Abbasi, which was named after the Shah. When he died, January 27, 1628, his dominions reached from the Tigris to the Indus. Abbas distinguished himself not only by his successes in arms, and by the magnificence of his court and of the buildings which he erected, but also by reforms in the administration of his kingdom. He encouraged commerce by constructing highways and building bridges. To foreigners, especially Christians, he showed a spirit of tolerance. 2 Englishmen, Sir Anthony and Sir Robert Shirley, or Shirley, were admitted to his confidence. His fame is tarnished by numerous deeds of tyranny and cruelty. His own family especially suffered from his fits of jealousy. His eldest son was slain, and the eyes of his other children were put out by his orders.
On this day in history, January 28th, 814, the death of Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, brings about the ascension of his son Louis the Pious as ruler of the Frankish Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the emperor. Louis I, born 778, died 840, surnamed the Pious. Roman Emperor, third son of the Emperor Charlemagne and his wife Hildegard, was born at Chasseneuil, in central France, and crowned King of Aquitaine in 781. His tastes were ecclesiastical rather than military. The government of his kingdom was mainly conducted by his counselors. In 794 or 795 he married Ermengarde, daughter of Ingram, Count of Hospen. After the deaths of his 2 elder brothers, Louis, at his father's command, crowned himself co-emperor at Aix-la-Chapelle on September 11, 813, and became sole ruler in the following January. He earned the surname of Pious by banishing his sisters and others of immoral life from court, by attempting to reform and purify monastic life, and by showing great liberality to the church. In October 816 he was crowned emperor at Rheims by Pope Stephen IV, and at Aix in July 817 he arranged for a division of his empire among his sons. This was followed by a revolt of his nephew, Bernard, King of Italy, but the rising was easily suppressed, and Bernard was killed, although in 818 Louis pardoned the followers of Bernard and restored their estates. In 819 he married Judith, daughter of Welf I, Count of Bavaria, who in 823 bore him a son, Charles, afterwards called the Bald. With the support of Judith's eldest stepson, Lothair, a district was carved out for Charles in 829. Discontent at this arrangement led to a rebellion in the following year. Provoked by Judith's inquiries with her favorite Bernard, Count of Barcelona, Lothair and his brother Pippin joined the rebels, and after Judith had been sent into a convent and Bernard had fled to Spain, an assembly was held at Compiègne, when Louis was practically deposed and Lothair became the real ruler of the empire. But at a second assembly held at Nimwegen in October 830, he was restored to power. Further trouble between Pippin and his father led to the nominal transfer of Aquitaine from Pippin to his brother Charles in 831. The emperor's plans for a division of his dominions then led to a revolt of his 3 sons. Louis met him in June 833 near Colmar, but owing possibly to the influence of Pope Gregory IV, who took part in the negotiations, he found himself deserted by his supporters, and the treachery and falsehood which marked the proceedings gave to the place the name of Lugenfeld, or Field of Lies. Judith, charged with infidelity, was again banished. Louis was sent into the monastery of Saint Medard at Soissons, and the government of the empire was assumed by his sons. But when the younger Louis had failed to induce Lothair to treat the emperor in a more becoming fashion, he and Pippin took up arms on behalf of their father. The result was that in March 834, Louis was restored to power at Saint Denis. Judith returned, and the kingdoms of Louis and Pippin were increased. The struggle with Lothair continued until the autumn, and he submitted to the emperor and was confined to Italy. An assembly at Didenhofen declared the deposition of Louis to have been contrary to law, and a few days later he was publicly restored in the Cathedral of Metz. In December 838, Pippin died, and the empire, except Bavaria, the kingdom of Louis, was now divided between Lothair, reconciled to his father, and Charles. The emperor was returning from suppressing a revolt on the part of his son Louis when he died on June 20th, 840, on an island in the Rhine near Ingelheim. He was buried in the church of St. Arnulf at Metz. Louis, who is also called Le Debonair, counts as Louis I, King of France. On this day in history, January 29th, 904, Sergius III is elected pope after coming out of retirement to take over the papacy from the deposed antipope Christopher. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the Pope. Sergius III, elected Pope by one of the factions in Rome in 898, simultaneously with John IX, was expelled from the city by his adversaries. He reappeared in 904, seized the two claimants, Leo V and Christopher, who were disputing the succession of Benedict IV, and had them strangled. His adherents rallied round the vestiarius Theophylact, a powerful Roman functionary, and his wife Theodora. Sergius is reputed to have been the lover of Theodora's daughter, Marozia, by whom he is said to have had a son, who became pope as John XI. Sergius was very hostile to the memory of Pope Formosus, and refused to recognize any of the ordinances celebrated by him, thus causing grave disorders. He also affected to consider as anti-popes not only John IX, but also his successors down to and including Christopher. He restored the Lateran Basilica, which had fallen down in 897. He died on April 14th in 911, and was succeeded by Anastasius III. On this day in history, January 30th, 1889, Archduke Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria, heir to the Austro-Hungarian crown, is found dead with his mistress, Baroness Mary Vetsera, in the Mayerling. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the Crown Prince. Rudolph of Habsburg, born 1858, died 1889, Crown Prince of Austria, was born on August 21st, 1858, the only son of the Emperor Francis Joseph of Austria, and his wife Elizabeth. Great hopes centered on the boy, who possessed unusual talents. Although his father was chiefly intent on his military education, Rudolph's own chief interests were natural history and literature. The monumental description of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, Österreich-Ungarn in Wort und Bild, was truly his conception and, in part, his work. He also wrote some minor works of his own. He early developed an interest in modern literature and thought, became known as a free thinker and even a revolutionary, and made no secret of his anti-clerical views. He thus drifted into increasing opposition to his father, which was accentuated by his notoriously easy morality. His marriage with Stephanie, daughter of the King of the Belgians, took place on May 10, 1881, and was at first happy, although its only fruit, unfortunately for the Austrian succession, was one daughter, Elizabeth, afterwards Princess Windischgratz. Later, he developed a deep passion for the young and beautiful Baroness Marie Vetsera, and on January 30th, 1889, the sudden and appalling news reached Vienna that the bodies of the two lovers had been found in Rudolph's hunting lodge of Mayerling, near Vienna. It was at once officially announced that the pair had committed suicide. All persons in any way connected with the story were sworn to secrecy, and the official dossier was excluded from state archives. Numerous extraordinary rumors naturally arose, connecting the death with the Jesuits, the Hungarian nobles, or an injured husband. But it is generally accepted that the Crown Prince actually shot his lover, and afterwards committed suicide in a fit of despair, partly due to his father's order to break off the liaison. On this day in history, January 31st, 1578, as part of the 80 Years' War and the Anglo-Spanish War, the Battle of Gembloux is a victory for Spanish forces led by Don John of Austria over a rebel army of Dutch, Flemish, English, Scottish, German, French, and Walloons. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the town of Gembloux. Gembloux, a town in the province of Namur, Belgium, 25 miles southeast of Brussels, on the main line to Namur. Population, estimated of 1930, was 5,198. Here, on January 31st, 1578, Don John of Austria defeated the army of the provinces under Antony de Gournay. In 1860, the State Institute of Agriculture was founded here. Gembloux is a busy railway center with engine works.